Solid. All the President's Men was the first film to tackle the Watergate scandal, the true story of the journalist that covered the huge scandal. The pairing of Dustin Hoffman and Robert Redford are a perfect pairing because of their contrast of physical and mental nature. Under the immense pressure of following Jaws, Steven Spielberg shows that he was not a one-trick pony in Close Encounters of the Third Kind, showing quite frankly the most plausible scenario. Human reaction would vary, but hopefully the smartest would prevail. At 44 years old, Gene Hackman shows that the second act is sometimes way better than the first. The Conversation is a monumental achievement in sound editing. We also see a very young Harrison Ford showing that his future is very bright. More great work from Francis Ford Coppola. The Conversation is a masterclass in paranoia and uneasy tension. There is just something so cool about the neo-noir film. The sultry setup, the wardrobe, but most come to a clean conclusion, and that is not Chinatown. Roman Polanski is a vile human being, but he is an excellent director. A gorgeous Faye Dunaway shines again, just a few years removed from Bonnie and Clyde, playing beautifully off Jack Nicholson, who once again is the man, and one could argue the greatest body of work of any actor. A rather grim story that deserves your attention, but that's just Chinatown. Prior to The Exorcist, William Friedkin put his name on the map with The French Connection. No one does the quick-cut, close-up, grainy shot like William Friedkin. The movie won 8 Academy Awards, with Gene Hackman taking home the gold as Best Actor, with quite possibly the best car chase of any movie in history. The overall scale and scope of the chase itself would be a stunning piece of art in any era. Add in a very game Roy Scheider, and you have one of the best films of all time. A side achievement of this film, the costumes, putting you right into those times. Before Dirty Harry, many pegged Clint Eastwood as a one-trick pony for spaghetti westerns, but we all learned quickly whether he's a cop, a cowboy, or a carnival worker, it doesn't matter. Clint is a badass with presence for days, with the cinematography showcasing the beauty of its stars, turning even the most mundane thug into an icon. It will make you believe that man can fly. Superman is the birth of the superhero film, especially on a grand scale. Gene Hackman shines as Lex Luthor, and there is no person who embodied Superman like Christopher Reeve, using every technique of the time and advanced direction to create one of the most everlasting superhero films ever made. An absolute feast on the eyes. A Clockwork Orange dared to go where no films had gone before. The gang leader, Alex, played by Malcolm McDowell, goes from depraved kingpin to an absolute mess of a human being. A study in social, political, and psychological themes, and for many, extremely hard to watch. The message is ultimately that Alex's descent is because of his vile sins. Kubrick at his best. Francis Ford Coppola does a complete 180 and gives you the gripping Vietnam War drama, Apocalypse Now. Exploring a common theme on this list, man's descent to chaos. Many of the actors becoming so engrossed in their roles, it took them years to recover. A daring and beautiful follow-up to The Godfather. And bonus points for dealing with Marlon Brando. A fantasy film for all ages, genders, and races. Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory is as good now than as it was in 1971. Some people are just born to play a certain role, and Gene Wilder was born to be Willy Wonka. Not completely word for word from the novel, however, its slight alterations make it far more palatable for all ages, even if Grandpa Joe is a total freeloader. Carrie is an all-time horror movie, but the last 20 minutes put it in another stratosphere. Sissy Spacek with possibly the best female performance of any horror movie. Carrie's slow-burning descent into chaos is what unleashes her fury. A movie that starts as teen angst, but turns into true trauma of what Carrie goes through, both by her disgusting classmates and vile mother. One of the best adaptations of a Stephen King book. Saturday Night Fever is a snapshot into disco-era New York City, the movie that literally spawned the disco era and brought John Travolta into every household. Beautiful dance sequences mixed in with the gruff exterior of a young man in the city just trying to make it to his next discotheque, and nobody could walk down a street better. Spawning 11 films, 20 shows, and over 100 books, Star Wars is deeply embedded in our culture, and the original brought it all on a shoestring budget. Not just a sci-fi epic, but a story about a child and his trauma and the people he meets along the way to help him. With stellar camera work and special effects for the time, this is a must-watch at any age. One can't help but still get immersed in the feeling that Star Wars gives you. It's somewhere between nostalgia and nerd food, of which I proudly am. Now I know what you're thinking. Mike, why wouldn't you choose the Holy Grail? And while I would say it's of course funny, this movie's better. Imagine telling a studio that you're going to do a parody retelling of the life of Jesus. This is something that I truly believe only could exist in the world of Monty Python. This is a parody, but a profoundly smart film. The message? Humans are very predictable creatures. I beg you to watch this if you haven't. A constant voice in my love for film is John Carpenter, and his inception is due almost solely in part to Halloween. The Michael Myers saga is a Greek tragedy in small-town America, the birth of the slasher film, and made a young Jamie Lee Curtis into a star before her 20th birthday. Sequels and reboots have tried and failed to capture the magic of the first film. But while chasing, you forget that greatness is in its simplicity. That somehow you could create a masterpiece on a small budget and a crappy William Shatner wig and mask. Michael Myers does not just react, he stalks his prey, creating unbelievable tension before he strikes. Perhaps the best thing about Alien is that you only see the xenomorph a handful of times. Throughout most of this film, he is stalking. The tension in this film was not only created by Ridley Scott, but the producers and advertisers who built up the tension to the release of this film. This is a movie that's still incredibly scary, incredibly real, and chock full of memorable scenes. Ripley showed us that female heroes can thrive in a male-dominated industry. The Deer Hunter is a completely masterful film, but one I will say is not one for repeat viewing. A movie willing to dwell into the macabre, disturbing Vietnam War underbelly, and one of the first films to tackle PTSD. Amazing performances by Robert De Niro, Meryl Streep, and Christopher Walken's best role, earning him top honors at the Oscars, showing that no one truly makes it out of war without scars. John Cazale also puts in great work in his final role, a grueling but beautiful watch. Those of you that know me know I'm a horror junkie at heart, and I believe The Exorcist is the scariest movie ever made. Many moviegoers in 1973 left this film screaming, crying, throwing up, even passing out. For years, I couldn't walk by a dark bedroom without making sure Reagan wasn't there waiting for me. Great acting? Yes. Great cinematography and film grain? You bet. Disturbing? Abso-friggin-lutely. I decided to quite self-indulgently put Godfather 1 and 2 together. I feel the saga of both films are tied to one another. Also, it's my list, so let's get rid of this sucker! Good, I'm glad I got that off my chest. We follow the trials and tribulations of the Corleone family, led by their patriarch Don Corleone, played by Marlon Brando in his most iconic role. These are also the films that made a relatively unknown stage actor named Al Pacino a young star. Again, in my opinion, the execution scenes that took place congruently with the baptism are the finest ever to be put on film. While many would argue The Godfather 2 is the superior of the two, Robert De Niro brings a young Don Corleone to life. One of the biggest questions we had from the first film was, what was an early Don Corleone like in the first place? What drove him into a life of crime? And how has it ultimately affected his young son Michael, who he never wanted for this life? And ultimately, the parallel between them was far too close than anybody could have ever imagined. As good as it gets storytelling. Now, I grew up with two Italian aunts who absolutely loved Mel Brooks. And as you can imagine, I jumped right in. I remember very vividly watching this with Aunt Jo and Aunt Rose, listening to them laugh. It was absolutely infectious. This film has always been controversial, but to be honest, it's really showing you how dumb racism is. Would today's standards accept it? I don't know. I think it's a clear anti-message that's hilarious and unbelievably true. Lost in the shuffle of all the megastars in this movie is Madeline Kahn, who actually received an Oscar nomination. A comedy that was bold and daring for the time and now. And I think today's comedy could take notes. When you have arguably the greatest director of all time making quite possibly his masterpiece, one has to sit in awe. There's very little, if anything, that comes close to being like Taxi Driver. Robert De Niro in absolute peak form, a terrifying glimpse into psychosis. At its heart, a scorn on politics, and made a young Jodie Foster a star. One of the most influential films of all time. Tobe Hooper creates a raw documentary-style feast with Texas Chainsaw Massacre. This film is so much more than its titular character, Leatherface. It is a look at depravity at its highest form. Using a fine-grained film, it's almost a green or a brown haze throughout the film. You can almost attribute the birth of found footage to Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Still beautiful, still great, and still horrifying. Rocky exploded into our hearts in 1977 to become one of, if not the greatest sports movie of all time. The movie that made Sylvester Stallone a household name. A movie used for both motivation and positivity. Rocky's an absolute timeless classic, and one that all ages can enjoy. In One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, we see one of the great rivalries unfold in film of McMurphy and Nurse Ratched. Plus, the beginnings of the careers of Danny DeVito, Christopher Lloyd, and a very young Brad Dourif. Not to mention a young Michael Douglas who helped write the screenplay. In my humble opinion, this is Jack Nicholson's finest role. A movie about freedom, dignity, and the cost of defiance. A man who arrived with such vigor turns into a complete absence of himself. His psychosis only heightened by the sense of confinement that he feels. Oscar wins for screenplay and direction by Milos Forman. A rite of passage in film is that everyone gets to experience Jaws. Jaws is so much more than a film. It's a complete dissection of a very common fear, the water. A movie so successful, it actually drove down the amount of great white sharks in the waters for the next 25 years. A movie also so good that Spielberg admittedly chased the success of Jaws for many years. The real standout is Robert Shaw's Quint, an absolute demon possessed by the thought of catching the killer shark. A film that's really two parts, on land and on sea. Most likely the best movie of the 20th century and continues to scare generations. Don't forget to join us next week for the best films of the 1980s.